It's 6:05, so let's go ahead and get started with our next presenter. So I'd like to now welcome Julie Mikolajczyk. So Julie, take it away. Do you have presenter access?
All right. Can you guys just see my presentation screen?
Yes, we can see you and the presentation screen, but can you put the presentation in slideshow mode from the beginning?
Okay. Good evening. I'm
Julie, hold on.
Oh, sorry.
Hold on one second. It's showing up.
Is it showing the other way? Okay, let me fix that again.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. I'm going to present the project that I did for our master's program, and that included assessing landscape fragmentation in central Arizona. This was to support the prioritization of grasslands for restoration treatments. These are activities that we're doing by the Arizona Game and Fish Department, which is my full-time employer. So this was to support that work. And this outline, this presentation is just going to be pretty straightforward, an intro and background, some summary of the methods and analysis that was done, overview of the results, and then I'll go over the conclusions and future work. So to begin, I just wanted to give you a background on grasslands and grassland health. Many of the grasslands in the United States have been degraded over the past century since we have settled in the West. This is due to changes in fire regimes, land use and development, increased herbivory, which is essentially grazing, and those have altered the structure of the grasslands themselves. The remaining grasslands, what is left, does need to be restored or at least managed appropriately by the land management agency that's responsible for that particular area. You can see down there at the bottom, juniper encroachment is one of the actions that happens with those altered fire regimes and increased herbivory. So including juniper removal, pinyon juniper removal is our solution at the current time. So this is our study area going from Phoenix, which is going to be down just at the very bottom of the study boundary. In that part just north of, or just south of Cordes Junction is the Agua Fria National Monument. That is the yellow color, that's BLM land. Going to the east, and then the other green area is the Prescott National Forest. And then obviously over to the west and through the central area is a checkerboard of state trust land, private lands, and in some cases checkerboard with between private and forest lands. So obviously there's always a finite number of resources available for whatever project you have going. And in order to assist with this allocation of resources, we did want to identify where those efforts would be the most effective on the ground. So in order to do this, I was brought in to help with a spatial analysis in order to support the decision making. Typically called a decision support tool is what I was tasked with creating. And to assist with that, we identified several different tiers of analysis, and those were essentially tied to management questions. So in order for us to narrow down our 2.4 million acres of our study area, we wanted to know which grasslands have the potential to be a grassland. And that is with information such as the slope of the land and the elevation, in addition to the vegetation type that's already there in the soils. Then we looked at this next tier, which is tier 2, only the lands that are going to be suitable to be grassland, and that's going to take into account things like current land use and that sort of information, so that we weren't building in an area that was already lost to grassland. And ultimately what we're trying to get to is, once we have an area identified, we want to be able to identify what treatment type would be most appropriate for that area. And this is a one-slide introduction to landscape ecology, landscape fragmentation. So it's a really intuitive idea, but I did want to include this so that you had an idea of what we were talking about here. So part of this Tier 2 analysis addresses the suitability of the landscape, and then one component of that, in addition to land use, would be the land fragmentation that occurs. And if you look at the diagram down here, you can see a block of land that was originally suitable for many different species, and the darker green was the core area where it's most intact and has less effects from a barrier, or it's not a transition between a habitat type, so it's all one particular veg community, something like that. There are species that like the edges, and there are species that need a core area to be more intact in order for the population to persist. So if you consider a road going through, then that's going to bisect your area, and it's going to create smaller core areas, and it's going to create more edge effect. That could be good for the animals that like the edges, but they still might have to transverse that new barrier that was put in place. And if that's not permeable, there are issues and potential implications for the population persistence. So to get started with the fragmentation analysis, we started with a data set called the Landscape Integrity. This was created in 2013 with Dr. Ryan Perkle from U of A. He and actually Sam and Garrett were working on that with Arizona Game and Fish Department. And with us, we identified 19 different factors that represent some modification on the landscape. Two of these factors I have starred here because they were modified from what the 2013 report indicates for this particular analysis. I removed the camping and recreation from consideration because the way that we represented it originally in the diagram or in the original model was poorly representative of the true effects of recreation in the area across the state. And then utility lines were also removed. I removed those because they have a limited impact on the pronghorn and grassland species in general. These together helped us create base or core areas that we can then look at to assess the landscape fragmentation in an area. So I moved on to assessing some of the different fragmentation software that was out there. There's many that are out there. Everything was free, of course, but when it comes free, it also comes with either a huge learning curve or the potential to not work at all, which was the case for those bottom four. They didn't work with the data that I had, or they didn't work with the version of GIS that I had. So they would have taken some modification to make that actually useful here. So I'll be talking about FragStats, and I'll just call it MEF calculator, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. But choosing to continue with those two was a good starting point, so I was able to at least narrow down the focus to what was available. And the FragStats is very commonly used to assess fragmentation, and it is very challenging to interpret both the inputs, the outputs, the different metrics that get created, and the reasons why you would want to choose something over another option. So it took a lot of trial and error to come up with what I thought was a useful set of metrics to evaluate based on a data set that was meaningful to landscape fragmentation in grasslands. So then I also included some MEF calculator, which assesses the effective mesh size in an area. And FragStats does that statistic as well, but it doesn't do it with a new method that was developed, and the author of that method created a Python script to do so. So one thing about FragStats is that it uses raster data as your input, whereas the MEF calculator uses vector data. Throughout this whole process, I had to keep two different data sets going simultaneously in order to service inputs into those. And in order to get the data into GIS or to be useful in our analysis, I did build model builder models. This one here represents the FragStats model that I created, and it shows that it's actually a dual model. You can see the top part is the same as the bottom part. That is because I analyzed the landscape integrity blocks by both the most impact, which is those with a score of 100, meaning it was the most intact data or integrity out there. And I also included some that had some sort of modification, not sure which was what, but it could have been restored, or it could be something that can be modified if the opportunity is there. So I kept two different data sets going through this analysis as well. A lot of the tools in this model builder are actually things like join and add field and calculate field, and the output of the FragStats model was a raster, but it was a raster in an ASCII format. So I had to convert that into a raster format, and then I had to convert the associated text files into text files that could be brought into GIS. So there was a lot of manipulating of the outputs in order to make them actually usable within our analysis. And then this is a simpler model. This was the MES calculator script that converted all our data into, ran the MES calculator tool and then converted it into what we needed for the outputs. So the fragmentation metrics that we have available are, I chose 10 of them to evaluate, and then of those, 5 of them I deemed to be useful, and I'm only going to show you those 5 right now. So the related circumscribing circle was the first one, and that one tried to say if you have a patch that is elongated, then that is going to have more fragmentation effects than one that has a circular pattern, meaning that it is more contiguous altogether. So if you see that big patch over to the left, it's dark green. That one is going to be close to a size of a circle, close to the area of a circle. So it's going to have a lower score, and therefore it's going to be more or less fragmented, essentially. Core area is percentile of landscape distribution. This one just shows the rankings of the patches according to size from the whole landscape, and that's going to help us set thresholds for size in further analyses. The number of core areas is another one that we included, and I'm actually going to skip over that one relatively quickly here. It wasn't used in the final analysis, but it will be useful in other things, other models that we do. The core area index, though, is important because it highlights the patch and core area shape and configuration, whereas some of the other ones only did one of those. Low scores indicate a fragmented area, and I think this one in combination with the next, the effective mesh size, are going to be most useful for our end model outputs. So this effective mesh size can be interpreted as the probability that any two random points within an area are connected. They don't have a barrier between them, so movement can occur without going into a barrier. Low scores indicate fragmented areas, whereas high scores indicate not fragmented. And unlike raster-based suitability modeling, this approach is actually shown here. You can't see it, but every single color on that screen in that study area is a hexagon. So I overlaid a hexagon mesh over the top of it and showed the various scores. So that one, I'll go back, that arrow is pointing to the particular thing that I selected, the hexagon I selected. And this shows you the different scores for those different metrics that you can see there, that you can then drill down and say, what is driving this particular end result? And being able to do that lets you add both a qualitative gut check, and it lets you be better able to explain your outputs and explain your reasoning, and it helps people understand the analysis better. So in conclusion, we were able to quantify the landscape fragmentation, and I think that with a few more steps, it's going to be useful in the project prioritization process, and it will help us identify or inform restoration projects. Creating custom tools and scripts needs to be continued for maintenance and updates, but relying on the tried and true frag stats also works, and you just have to kind of take the time to learn what it means. Unlike raster-based suitability modeling, this hexagon approach actually allows for a robust and interactive review of parameters and outputs. Eventually, we'd like to take this into a web format so that it's driven by the user at the end. That's something that we're going to be working on this next fiscal year. And then non-GIS savvy stakeholders more easily understand this approach when you can look at the parts that go into it, and it doesn't have to be a black box kind of it spit out an output and that's the answer. You'd have to go into all of the individual inputs to see what could have driven that. So some of the next steps will include reviewing outputs, going out and doing some ground truthing of random points to try to assess some accuracy of our model, incorporating these into our Tier 2 analysis, which means trying to rescale these down into a single scale that can then be compared between different data sets. And we're going to need to find out how to combine those 5 factors together into a meaningful measure of fragmentation. So all of those will need to be done in order for it to be incorporated into that Tier 2 analysis. And that is actually it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Let's give Julie a round of applause. Okay, and now I want to open the floor up to questions. So remember, if you have a question, just unmute your mic. Or if you're in Tucson, then you can just ask a question there.
Better again. How difficult was it to gather all the data? Does it change off?
Did somebody say something I can't hear?
Oh, hello, Julie. On this side. Well, this is Brian Cunningham. I had a question on how difficult was it gathering the data? Does the data change often?
Gathering the data for this particular aspect wasn't that difficult because we had created, I'm kind of on a long-term connectivity, wildlife landscape connectivity. That's kind of the scope of my career so far. So I already had a lot of data already created and I knew it needed to be incorporated. For the bigger picture of the CAGS model and the Central Arizona prioritization, it's a lot of data. It's understanding soils, it's understanding the slope and talking with stakeholders, talking with experts, trying to figure out what matches, what is meaningful for grassland restoration, what's meaningful for grassland occurrence. So that was definitely a bigger challenge than the aspect that's shown here. The hardest part of this one was the figuring out which metrics were most appropriate.
Any other questions? Okay, Julie, I have a question. So you said that you were planning to turn this into some kind of web-based application where you could share the information. Do you know what platforms you are thinking about doing that in?
I don't have a set platform right now. At Arizona Game and Fish, we just got an enterprise license agreement. So we have a lot more options out there than maybe we used to. I would assume that we're going to use our GIS server, and I don't know what particular platform and server is going to be most appropriate. I doubt we'll go Silverlight or obviously not Flash, so we'll probably stick to the either the app builder or something a little bit more custom. But that's also going to be part of an RFP that I send out this next few months in order to get somebody on board, and it will depend on their capabilities as well. So nothing set in stone yet.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from online? Remember, you can just unmute your mic, or from in the room in Tucson. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have, so thank you again, Julie.
Great, thank you.
So that concludes our presentations for today. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we will be back again this Monday